Howdy, 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 this is Ryan Acid Heads Murphy coming to you with Exploring Metal, a look at the heavy metal genre for those who are not familiar with it, who are interested in getting into the heavy metal genre, or at least trying to understand it better. So in the first episode we talked about things like classical music, blues, and earlier types of music that influenced what would become heavy metal in various ways, and then in the second video, we talked about the two bands, that would be Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, who pretty much created the genre, in particular the two primary branches of heavy metal. So in this one we're going to be talking about how it became its own distinct genre. Because Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin were still heavily influenced by things like rock, which is always going to be an influence on heavy metal regardless, because that's where it's really born from. But also they were heavily influenced by blues, to the point that notoriously Led Zeppelin ripped off a lot of blues artists to create a lot of their early songs. But they got some really great results. As I said, I don't condone what they did, but the results speak for themselves. So now we're going to get into some of the bands, and I'm just going to kind of cherry pick out a few that kind of established heavy metal as its own thing, kind of breaking away from the blues influence. And we're going to be talking about a few bands here, kind of covering the 70s and then getting into the 80s. Early 80s here. So we're going to talk about Judas Priest, Motorhead, AC/DC, Def Leppard, Iron Maiden, and Van Halen. Quiet Riot, actually. Kind of covering a lot of territory here. And then, of course, we could go even further and just cover 80s hair metal. But, if you want to explore hair metal, then you can kind of do that on your own. You don't need me to give you any guidance. I'm trying to take you through some of the stuff that established these ideas. So Judas Priest and Motorhead are significant because Judas Priest was kind of the first band to move away from the blues influences. They were one of them. So, I'm trying to think of the best way. They really were the band that kind of established heavy metal as its own distinct genre, where you could finally hear it kind of branching out and going off in its own directions. So, some of the songs that I would suggest from Judas Priest, well, hold on, let me save those song suggestions for the end of the video. Make that a little easier. And then we get Motorhead. Again, definitely moving away from the blues influences of earlier heavy metal. They kind of blended stuff that, like the Black Sabbath kind of sound and what stuff like Judas Priest were doing, and they blended that with punk, which was a thing in the 70s, the earliest, early punk, the first punk music movement. And punk was all about craziness, about breaking the rules and being anarchistic. And Motorhead kind of combined metal with punk and continued the evolution of what would become thrash metal, which we'll get to, with kind of that just balls to the wall sort of style. AC/DC with some of their earlier stuff with Bon Scott, their first lead singer, Jailbreak, for example, and Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap. kind of established, again, less of a blues influence in their music. Now, some people would say AC/DC isn't really metal, it's hard rock. But even then, they still had a hell of a lot of influence. Okay. Then we want to talk about Def Leppard. They were heavily influenced by Led Zeppelin. And they kind of continued that trend of what Led Zeppelin had done, but taking it even further into metal. They were kind of the stepping stone between the Led Zeppelin era and what would become hair metal. Then you have Iron Maiden, who were kind of, not the first, but they were one of the earliest power metal groups. Again, we're talking about stepping stones here. We're talking about groups that took things like what, again, Led Zeppelin had done, but then put their own spin on it and took it off in a different direction. This is where you start seeing a lot more of the storytelling and theatricality start creeping in, along with the really soaring vocals becoming even more pronounced, and the solo. And of course, Van Halen. Again, Van Halen, there's not really a lot to say about him, because again, you're starting to get the solo is starting to become the big thing, the big important thing. And then of course, Come On Feel the Noise, Quiet Riot, even though that's a cover song, but Quiet Riot, the first heavy metal song to actually become, I think it was a number one hit on Billboard. It was the first top 10 hit of heavy metal, I believe. If not the first number one hit. I can't remember if it was just the first top 10 or the first number one. Either way, it was the first heavy metal song that you could actually say made it, in a way. So these bands are important because they're the standout examples. They're not necessarily the first ones to do what they did, but they are the standout examples that established what basically became, party metal and hair metal with Van Halen and Def Leppard, pop metal, if you want to call it that, AC/DC, arena rock, arena metal, and of course, power metal. Then, of course, you had Judas Priest and Motorhead, who were really pushing the heavy metal part of metal music. So you have more, again, with Def Leppard and Van Halen and Quiet Riot, you have the beginnings of pop metal and the various subgenres within that. AC/DC, you have that arena rock, arena metal, just the big stadium shows. That's starting to get born from them and similar groups. Iron Maiden is kind of the birth of, or again, the most standout example of the birth of power metal, which is again about telling stories, theatrics, big soaring operatic almost vocals. And then, of course, you have, again, Judas Priest and Motorhead kind of pushing the grimier, dirtier metal, gritty metal side of things. And they would all, again, it's like a tree. The development of any genre is like a tree. It starts at a root. Black Sabbath, well, the roots are really the older stuff, and then it starts to sprout, and that's Black Sabbath, and then a little bit further along you get Led Zeppelin, and then it starts branching off in various distinct areas. So let's get to some recommendations here. So for Judas Priest, and again, I'm going to stick mostly to hits here, so most people would consider these the most approachable songs for these bands. For Judas Priest, older stuff, Hellbent for Leather, kind of their first hit song, I believe. Their first good or well-selling song. Breaking the Law, Living After Midnight, You've Got Another Thing Coming, and a newer one that I really like is Prophecy from Nostradamus. That's the album. Prophecy is the song, Nostradamus is the album, Judas Priest. Okay, so Breaking the Law, Living After Midnight, You've Got Another Thing Coming, Hellbent for Leather, Prophecy. All really good songs. Then we've got Motorhead, Ace of Spades. It's the classic. You gotta listen to Ace of Spades. I'm not really a big Motorhead fan, honestly, but you can just check out their catalog if you want to get deeper into it than that. I really like Ace of Spades, but other than that, I'm not a big fan. It's not that I dislike them, it's not a group that I pursue very much. So AC/DC, let me see here, and wouldn't you know it, I don't seem to have any of them on this playlist. That figures. So let me look at my album list over here. AC/DC, guess that'll do. I mean, there's lots of their tracks here. I'm trying to find where the hell did they get to? Okay, for some reason I'm not finding my AC/DC stuff in here very easily. Well, Jailbreak, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, Money Talks, Back in Black, Thunderstruck, The Jack. That's more of a blues rock song, so not a whole lot of heavy metal influence there. Hell's Bells, Highway to Hell, of course. For Those About to Rock. You Shook Me All Night Long. Okay. Then, that's most of their big hits. Again, with AC/DC, it's hard rock, kind of right there on the edge of hard rock and heavy metal, and we're talking about the big arena show type stuff. Def Leppard, again, that's where you're starting to... A lot of people would say they're not even heavy metal, they're just hard rock, or just rock. But that's also where you start seeing a lot of snobbery that you'll unfortunately run into with heavy metal. But it isn't exclusive to heavy metal by any stretch of the imagination. It's something that happens with any kind of music. People will get snobbish about what is and isn't allowed, because then they're making it about themselves and their ego. But that's a whole different thing. So, Def Leppard, you got Pour Some Sugar on Me, Photograph, Let's Get Rocked, Armageddon It, Rock of Ages, Hysteria, Bringing on the Heartbreak, Two Steps Behind. So, again, just look up their greatest hits and you'll find some good songs in there that kind of show you the origins of what became hair metal and party metal. Van Halen, you got Jump, Eruption as a solo, but again, just look up the Van Halen greatest hits. I'm not a big Van Halen fan either. Quiet Riot, I'd say Come On Feel the Noise and Bang Your Head would be the two good songs to check out. And again, the point there is that you're seeing where during the 80s, late 70s and into the 80s, where heavy metal is really branching out. And there's also lots of other stuff that happened in the 80s. We're not done with the 80s by any stretch of the imagination. But at the moment, we're going to stick to where it's kind of branched out the most from what we've already talked about. You know, that the branching off from Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, where you're getting, Judas Priest and Motorhead and those types of bands are branching out from more of the Black Sabbath side of things, and then you've got Led Zeppelin that's influencing people like Iron Maiden and Van Halen and Def Leppard and all them. I missed Iron Maiden, didn't I? Run to the Hills is the classic Iron Maiden song. Let me find them over here. Basically, just listen to The Number of the Beast. The entire album, the whole thing. The Number of the Beast, that would be your primer for Iron Maiden. It's not their first album, but it's one of their best. Alright, so that's where we start getting into where heavy metal has really branched off. Now we're going to start getting into some of the other branches in the next video that are really the branches from the Black Sabbath side of things. Most of these are branched off from either hard rock or rock in general, like with AC/DC and Van Halen and all those, or we were talking about Led Zeppelin influenced branching. Now, in the next one, we're going to get into some of the really, really darker stuff and the fast stuff. Alrighty, so I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.